This is the Comics Alternative, episode 284, Reviews of the Escapist Omnibi. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I am Pascal, and we are two guys with advanced degrees talking about comics.
And on this week's episode, Pascal and I are going to discuss the two Omnibi collections of Michael Chabon's The Escapist from Dark Horse. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
And the two Escapist collections that we're going to be discussing today are still available on Discount Comic Book Service, and each of them are 40% off. That's only $14.99 for a hefty tome of comics. They run about 400 pages each.
Yeah, they're big ones.
A great deal.
That's right. And, that's because you really can't beat the great deals at Discount Comic Book Service. You may try, but you can't. Go to dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Well, Pascal, those who listen to the podcast on a regular basis, when they hear your voice, they probably automatically think of our Eurocomics series. But this is not a Eurocomics episode.
No, it's not. Although it has some French connections that we'll get into later.
Yeah, that's right. But no, this week Paul couldn't be a part of the podcast, and I asked Pascal if he would like to co-host a regular review show, and he gladly said yes. So thank you, Pascal. I'm looking forward to talking about the Escapist volumes with you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I hope I will do justice to the main podcast.
Before we get into a discussion of this week's texts, we should mention that we do have some communications from listeners.
Great.
Mail time. Mail time.
Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
Yes, we get to see our old friend Mailbox, but this time we have mail not so much like via email or through social media, but we have a very dedicated listener who left us a message on Google Voice. And in fact, I didn't discover this until after HeroesCon this weekend. I ran into this listener, Sturge Bazakis, and he's a dedicated listener to the show. He's also a supporter of ours on Patreon. And he mentioned something about the Google message, and I overlooked that. So I want to go ahead and share that with listeners now.
Hi, this is Sturge Bazakis. I have a PhD and I read comics. And I'm just calling because I'm on a road trip, and I just listened to Gwen and Paul talk about the Dragon Slayer and other stories and the Lost Path and their discussion, and I just wanted to drop a line that I really appreciated it. Got two really small kids at home, besides working and juggling, my career and my wife's career, and I miss a lot. So it was really good for me to hear about all the state of affairs of the children's book industry and how it intersects with comics. And I definitely want to go look up a bunch of those resources that you have listed in the show notes. Anyway, that's it. Just want to say thank you for keeping me abreast, doing academic public service, and helping me on my road trip. All right. Take care, y'all.
And thanks, Sturge, for sending us that message or calling us and leaving us that message. I hope you drove carefully as you were leaving that message, because Sturge was on the road when he called us. But, whether you call us or email us or send us a message via whatever social media platform you choose to use, we do like hearing from you.
We definitely do. Thank you for leaving a message. At least we know we're not speaking in a void.
That's right. Okay, Pascal, you want to begin talking about this week's texts?
Let's go.
Okay, now we're going to be looking at two, I guess they're Omnibi collections, released from Dark Horse Books. And the first one, and we're not going to necessarily look at these in order, but the first one that was published was back in February of this year, Michael Chabon's The Escapist, Amazing Adventures. And then this week, the second volume in the Omnibi collection, Michael Chabon's The Escapist, Pulse-Pounding Thrills, comes out, at least for wide release. It may have been in comic shops earlier, but it's this week on June 19th that the book gets wide release. In other words, you can buy it on Amazon and find it in bookstores. So now we have, I guess, with both of these volumes, Amazing Adventures, which came out in February, and I'm getting tongue-tied. Pulse-Pounding Thrills that's coming out this week. All of the Escapist stories that have been released, and even more. Now, Pascal, when the Escapist comics were coming out, I don't know, a number of years ago.
2004?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, were you reading them then?
Yeah, at the time, I have one of the original collections, the one that has a Chris Ware cover that collects some of those texts, and then I read the other one, which is the Brian K. Vaughan 6-issue miniseries. Yeah,
now we should mention that one of the things we're not going to be discussing is
that.
Michael Chabon's The Escapists, plural, because that's a completely different beast. After the Escapist run of comics from Dark Horse, then there was a 6-issue series that Brian K. Vaughan wrote called The Escapists, plural, as opposed to the Escapist comics. And actually that collection, a new volume of Michael Chabon's The Escapists by Vaughan, came out in October of last year, but we're not going to be discussing that. Pascal, you and I are just going to be focusing on the two Escapist collections. So it's the actual Escapist comics themselves.
The anthologies, yes.
Exactly, yeah. These Omnibi collections. In fact, in the first volume, Amazing Adventures, we have 26 stories. 2 of them have never before been collected, and 6 have never before been published. And the volume that comes out this week, Pulse-Pounding Thrills, we have 22 stories. 3 of them have never before been collected, and 5 have never before been published. So I'm like you, Pascal, I got those first 2 volumes, the collections of the Escapist stories. I also have some of the earlier issues that came out before those collections, but I have those collections. But if you have those earlier collections, you still don't have everything that you can find in these 2 Dark Horse Omnibis.
Yeah, these are really the complete releases.
Exactly. So you have a lot of all the original releases and more.
Yes, I was wondering if they purposely, did not publish some of them just to recreate that Escapist idea, like some lost issues, lost stories. They keep talking about, throughout the book, there are inserts with little essays about the history of comics, and they keep talking about all those lost stories that were not published or destroyed because of their content. It's kind of interesting.
That's right. Well, what we're doing is we're describing I guess, a context, assuming that our audience knows what we're talking about. And I would venture to guess that most listeners of the podcast know The Escapist and the story behind that. But there may be some who are unaware of The Escapist. So maybe we can set some kind of context. In, I think it was 2000, Michael Chabon, the novelist, published a book, a novel, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. And basically what it was, I mean, you can call it a love story to the American comics industry. And in many ways, I guess it was. But it basically was a story about these two creators, Cavalier and Clay. And they create this, and I think Cavalier comes from Czechoslovakia, and he actually escaped Prague, supposedly, in a box along with a golem.
That's correct.
Yeah, so not only is there this symbolic emphasis on rebirth, but there's the link to the Jewish mythology as well, and how that eventually plays into the creation of this superhero that he and Sam Clay create called the Escapist. So Cavalier makes his way to the United States. He meets his cousin, Sam Clay, and they work together to create this heroic figure, the Escapist. And he doesn't really have any superpowers. He just has an uncanny ability to escape, to get out of a jam, no matter what it is, to get out of cages, sarcophagi, you name it. Anything that could bind him, chains and whatnot, he can get out of. And that's what his special power becomes. And so the novel, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, is in some ways also, I guess, a tip of the pen, or in the case of the novel, a tip of the typewriter or the keyboard, to Siegel and Schuster and their creation of Superman and some of the things that they went through. So you have, if not the exact same drama, then at least somewhat similar drama going on with Cavalier and Clay and the creation of their figure, the Escapist. There is a woman that comes into play, Rosa Sachs, I believe her name is, who becomes the love interest of Cavalier. Clay eventually marries her. It becomes kind of convoluted, but in a very good and novelistic way. It's a phenomenal novel, and it ended up winning, I think it's the 2001 Pulitzer Prize for Best Novel.
Yeah, and it also borrows from the lives of a lot of cartoonists like Kirby, Eisner. It's kind of a mix of, it's creating this kind of alternate or parallel, I guess, comic book history.
It does. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's just, in a way, it's interesting now because I read the book a while back, and I just didn't think about it when Charlie Hawk Chai by Sonny Lu came out. There is kind of a connection in the concept of retelling the story, that, creating characters that are cartoonists to kind of describe a period, or a history of the country, but it could be real, but it's not. But I didn't think about that parallel until I reread those books, those collections.
I'm glad that you pointed that out. I didn't even think about that, of linking this with what Sonny Lu does in Charlie Chan Huck Chai. You're right, because what both Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay does and Lu's book does is they create, I don't know if we want to call it an alternate history or a false history or a false biography. In other words, it's the story of creators' lives, creators who were fictionalized, who never existed. And so it's not as if we have an alternate history of America at this time or the comic book industry. It's just we have the story of a life during this period of history that unfolds in ways that are real, that we can recognize, that actually happened, but they're nonetheless fictional. So you're right. He is doing something. Chabon is doing something very similar to what Sonny Lu does, with the exception of this. Sonny Lu does it in comics. Michael Chabon, originally at least, did it in prose. Now, what we're going to be discussing are a variety of comics about and based around this character, the Escapist, that are basically what Cavalier and Clay, and then eventually others, created. Now, the thing that's really interesting about these Escapist stories, and this gets back to where you were going a moment ago, is that these are stories that are supposed to be historically set. In other words, certain publishers who are no longer around publish these stories. There's a history behind some of these creations, but they're all false histories. They're all false context and background. But the interesting thing about the Escapist comics is that, and you have these essays scattered throughout both of these collections, Amazing Adventures and then Pulse Pounding Thrills, we have little mini histories about these stories, but they're histories that are false. It never did happen. But the writers of these articles act, along with Michael Chabon, of course, act as if these comics actually existed, and some of them are just now being found and being published and shown to readers for the very first time. So, I mean, it's really interesting what they're doing here.
Yeah, it is. It is kind of an interesting game, but actually, the essays are maybe 80% correct. They're 80% historical, but they just inject the escapist thing
It's the
in the middle.
escapist part. Yeah, that's the false part.
But that kind of mirror what was happening at the time in history. So that's why also it's really similar to the Sonny Liu thing, when he's really teaching us about Singapore through fake comics. This is teaching us about comic history, American history, through fake comics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so what Chabon and the various creators do, because there are a lot of artists and a lot of writers who are a part of both of these volumes, is they kind of wedge in their escapist comics into an actual history that we recognize. So you're right. A lot of the stuff that they talk about, historically speaking, did occur and did happen, except for the escapist stories. But they're able to kind of shove in the escapist stories history along with the other stuff that actually did happen. So it's fascinating.
They even borrow actual events and kind of reinterpret them with the escapists as the focus character. I'm thinking about. They even mentioned like the Green Arrow story that is very famous for talking about addiction in the 70s. The Devin O'Neill story, and they kind of do the same thing where the escapist is looking at euthanasia. It's the same principle, except the escapist story is completely fake, never came out in the 70s, but so it's an interesting mirror game. I think it teaches you about comic history at the same time. So
it does. And, as readers of the original novel, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay will know, is that Michael Chabon is a student of that history of comic books. And so he knows what he's talking about here. So he and the creators who are associated with the various escapist comics are very much aware of the actual history. And I think that makes them especially adept at shoving in here and there little bits of false history into the true history. So,
yeah. And I noticed he actually writes the story of only one of the stories in the collections. The first one, Michael Chabon, he writes The Passing of the Key. He's credited as a story writer on this one, but all of the other stories are written by comic book writers, cartoonists. And I was wondering about this. Why didn't he write more? Or maybe he doesn't feel like that's his medium. I don't know. But The Passing of the Key is quite a good story, actually. And it's interesting that it's called The Passing of the Key. It's almost like a metaphor for him passing his creation to other artists and writers.
That's right. And, one thing he says, okay, at the very end of the second volume, Pulse Pounding Thrills, the one that comes out this week, the last piece of that collection, I believe, is the address that Michael Chabon gave, is the keynote speech at the Eisner Awards in 2004. And in that keynote speech, he mentions that he's only, at least as of 2004, had only written 2 comic stories. So one of them was, I guess, The Passing of the Key. And I'm not sure what the other one was by that point. I don't know, at least off the top of my head. But you're right. The vast majority of the stories in these 2 collections are written by other creators. Many of them whose names we will probably recognize, some whose names I'm not necessarily familiar with except for being associated with the Escapists. Same thing with the artists. Many of them, I think probably most of them would be recognizable to listeners of the show. So, someone can look at a Kyle Baker art and know that that's Kyle Baker, Howard Chaykin, things of that sort, creators of that sort. So, a lot of people were involved in the Escapist project, which is another thing that makes it so exciting.
True.
Now, both of us are familiar with these Escapist stories. And, as I mentioned, I have, just as you do, Pascal, the 2 original collections of The Escapist. And it had been a long time since I read both of them, because I'd read them several times. And I think the last time I read them, and I read them in tandem, was probably somewhere around like 2008 or 2009, something like that. My experience reading these 2 Escapist volumes, the 2 Omnibi volumes from Dark Horse that we're discussing, I found it a little more laborious this time.
It's a little overwhelming. There is a lot of material. And I think it's also what happens when you read anthologies. It can feel uneven. There's so many art styles, you'd be kind of jumping around. So I think, especially in a newer volume, they do a good job of structuring it thanks to those essays. And I think the volume as a whole functions better. The first one, they do an essay at the beginning and at the end. There's maybe one in the middle, but it's not as structured in terms of the chronology of the stories or how they relate to comic history. You kind of have to make your guesses on that one. So, yeah.
Well, there is, I think for me at least, the most significant essay among these, or between these 2 collections, is in the first collection. And this comes after that first story, Passing of the Key. And it's by Malachi B. Cohen, Escapism 101. And basically, as I guess as the title suggests, you have a brief overview of the history of the Escapist and where his various stories appeared, or who the publishers were, and the ups and the downs of the various publishing houses that supposedly, according to this fake history, owned the rights to the Escapist.
Yeah, because it's interesting that the property was sold and lost multiple times, so it jumped from different publishers that had a very different agenda and different view of the medium. So the character can go through all these different iterations, from very mainstream to strangely indie. So I think that's a brilliant idea to then go into this collection and basically anybody can do an escapist story, no matter what their the type of comic they want to produce. It can be done in any genre. So you can go from Howard Chaykin to Andy Watson or Eddie Campbell. It's all over, all over the spectrum, really.
Yeah, or Paul Horsheimer, who in the first volume does a variety of these short comedic pieces. Now, Did you find that you appreciated the first volume more than the second, or the second more than the first, or just both the same?
As a whole, I think for some reason I got into the second volume more, and I think there is the second volume is unique because of the Will Eisner piece. I feel that this alone is, for me, that's a reason to buy it. If you don't have this, because historically it's supposedly, I think it is the last Will Eisner story ever that he did, right? So it is, and what the story does, I think, is very powerful. And I understand they put it at the beginning of the collection, but
close to the beginning, yeah.
Yeah, it's like the second one, right? But maybe they should have saved it for the end. I don't know. But yeah, this story for me was really the high note of the collection. And like I said, I like the way they, instead of having the essay at the beginning, they kind of try to organize things chronologically for the history of comics and have those essays illustrate and then show a story that corresponds. So I think overall I enjoy the second volume more.
Yeah, I'd be hard-pressed to say which one stands out more for me. Although I will mention that, at least given my reading experience of this second volume, Pulse Pounding Thrills, I think by the end of that volume, they felt to me that they were petering out. And what I mean by that is not that the stories weren't as good. It's just they weren't escapist stories.
True. Yeah.
So, yeah, we had the story, I think the very last story of that second volume was of Machine Gun Man, right?
Yeah, and before that we have the Rosa Sachs.
The Rosa Sachs story, the romances.
Yeah.
And again, there's nothing wrong with those. I like those stories well enough. It's just, it's not as if the anthology lost its focus, because, those are stories that are also supposedly a part of this false mythos, right?
Yes.
So they definitely have a part, but they had nothing whatsoever to do with Escapist, I guess, at least directly. And so I didn't find them as compelling, although I did like the stories, especially the one with the Machine Gun Man. Is that his name?
Yes.
Yes.
That's cool. And Mr. Machine Gun.
Mr. Machine Gun, that's it, yeah. Mr. Machine Gun, Arms, and the Man I Sing is the name of that. It's a long story.
Yeah, it is a long one, but yeah, on its own, it's a good story. But you're right that it takes us away from the usual escapist type stories. And one thing I was thinking about is the concept of the escapist, this guy that can escape from any situation. The original concept is sometimes, it is not always easy to find a story that is very interesting, because you always have that, you have, the easy ways to put him in a situation where he's restrained and he has to escape. And that's, after a while, that's not very exciting. Or they create a reason for him to put on a show with his acolytes, so they can have an escape. I think the most successful stories try to use the concept of escaping and apply it to a situation where it's not just a Houdini trick, right? I'm thinking about this story about the Vietnam War where where he's trying to basically help a soldier escape from his PTSD. And I lost it. It's in the second volume?
That's in the second volume, isn't it? Or see, after a while, you're right, with these anthologies, after a while, they kind of all meld into one. But I think it's in the second volume that we get the Vietnam stories.
Yeah, it's a story so it's supposed to be mirroring what Harvey Kurtzman was doing with the all these war comics.
Right.
And it takes place in Vietnam, and the escapist is a soldier, and he's there's another soldier that is kind of shell shocked, and he's helping him escape, metaphorically from his condition.
Mm-hmm.
And that one is it's a better use, I think, of the concept. So there are a few like this that I thought were very interesting. But yeah, the one revolving only around just escaping, literally, maybe not. Yeah, not as successful.
Yeah, and that one that you were referring to about the Vietnam War is called Another Man's Escape. And I think that one was one of the more successful ones, at least for me, in that second volume. Now, when you were talking earlier about the act of escaping and staging something so that he can escape, I don't know, I couldn't help but think of the first story of the second collection, and that is the death of the Escapist. And this is when the Escapist and his crew go to this fictional republic of Rhodesia that is ruled by this despot. And he is proud of the fact that no one can get out of his grip, that he has a control on everything, and that people who try to escape his regime are killed. And so there's someone who works closely with this leader, and he is a big fan of the Escapist. And so what the Escapist does when they visit Rhodesia is to help this guy, at least on first appearance, escape the country, but actually he chooses to stick around and fight in his own way. So he himself becomes an escapist.
Yeah, it's a strange setup because it's a totalitarian regime where the escapist comics are banned, right? They are censored, but this aid of the despot who is, I guess, in charge of checking what publications come to the country, and he's actually a fan. So his job is to present those comics and destroy them, but he keeps them and reads them, right? And that kind of gives him kind of sparks his rebellion to free the country. In the end, we hope that's what's going to happen. And I don't know, how did you feel about that story? Did you
the one that we're just talking the death of the Escapist? I like that one, and I thought that was, I guess, an appropriate use of the quote unquote magic act of escaping. You know, the sensational stage presence of the Escapist, because I think his name originally on stage was Mysterioso.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I think that the use of his stage presence, which is not really a part of most of these stories, right? I mean, obviously we get it in the very first piece, The Passing of the Key, when Tom Mayflower's, it's his uncle, right? Yeah, who is the original Escapist. And then when he passes, then he passes on, so to speak, the key,
the golden key.
Yeah, the golden key to his nephew, Tom Mayflower.
Yeah, so he becomes the next generation, like the superhero trope of having, Robin, Batman, etc.
Right, and also, and he's also been sanctioned by, what's the league called? The League of the Golden Key, is that it?
Yes.
Yeah. As opposed to the Iron Chain, which is their antithesis.
Yeah, it's the evil fascistic group that is trying to take over the world.
Yeah, or at least during the early part of the century, the earlier stories, they're fascistic, and so they're associated with the Nazis. And then later on, though, they're associated with the communists.
True. There's a strange shift in one of the stories where there's a stories that was banned, supposedly was banned, where
in this false history,
yeah, we see the shift between the fascists and the communists, where the communists are actually fighting the fascists, so the escapists has to help them, and And that story didn't fly in the 50s, so it was kept away from readers until now.
Yeah, and that one, okay, you're talking about the EC Comics inspired one, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And let me see, which volume, because trying to keep track of these.
It's volume 2.
Okay, so it appears in volume 2. This is, which one is this?
It's hard to keep track of all of them.
I know. And I only have a PDF of this second volume. So trying to find that is going to be a little difficult. But yeah, that's one of those stories, because you're right. We do have both the Nazis and the communists, but the communists seem to be kind of the good guys, at least after a while. Because they're not really Stalinists, but they have a beef with Stalin. So they don't say that they're Trotskyites, but there's something like that.
Yes. But there's this ambiguity that's played there.
Yeah. Oh, okay, so this is the one. I found it. It is Heil and Farewell.
Okay.
Yeah. Heil and Fearwell. That's it. And, this is one of those, I'm glad you mentioned this one, because this raises an issue that I wanted to discuss with some of these stories. Now, you had mentioned earlier that many of these stories vary in style. And, a lot of that, of course, has to do with the writer and especially the artists who do these individual stories. But also, much of the style, in many cases, is dictated by the kind of comic or its place in comic book history where this story supposedly settles. So, for instance, that Vietnam War story has a particular tone, given the fact that it came out, supposedly, according to this false history, I guess in the late 1960s, maybe early 1970s. Some of the more socially conscious escapist stories took place in the early 1970s, the Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams, what they did with Green Arrow, Green Lantern. But other comics, other stories of the escapist that fall in different historical periods reflect those periods or a particular publisher style. And with Heil and Fearwell, it's obviously inspired by EC Comics because, well, first off, the premise is a little outrageous and wild. We have Mengele, who's a part of this story. But we also have a lot of violence. And not just any violence, but we have a main character, a main villain, who chops up people and shoves them in desks and then bags them up later, throws them in a river or a lake, and then through some kind of weird process, the various parts, the severed limbs and whatnot, cohere one to the other to create this kind of monstrosity that comes back to take revenge. I mean, it's really wild. It's really over the top. And I guess in some way it reflects the EC style, but basically what it does is it takes the EC style and dials it up to 11. And it goes over the top, but intentionally so. So, Pascal, my question to you is, do you think that there are certain entries between these two collections that take a particular style or historical period or publisher-inspired house style and kind of go overboard with it?
Do too much with it?
Yeah. To where it becomes almost too ridiculous. I mean, I know what they're doing, and many times they're trying to be funny, and I think successfully so. But sometimes, do you think that they push a little too far, the creators?
Well, actually, I felt that sometimes it's hit or miss in the case that sometimes they don't really go do it. Sometimes they keep a style that is nondescript or really doesn't feel of that period, right? Like that very first story we're talking about. it looks like a modern comic. It doesn't really have that feel. So I actually like it better when even if they go too far, like that EC one. I like it better when they do this, when they really try to mimic an actual time period in the history of comics. Like the Matt Kindt story, I thought was very well done. Mm-hmm. But it's more about the form and the look of the comic than maybe the story. There's not much of a story in his short story, but he made it look like an old comic book.
What, the Matt Kindt one?
I like that. Yes, the Matt Kindt one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the name of that one. And is that in the second volume or the first?
It's the second one. Oh, it's so hard to scroll through this. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I know what you're talking about. But yeah, well, it's the Escapist chain reaction. Mm-hmm. And one of the things and that's supposedly, according to this false history, a lost story that I think no one knew that it existed before it was discovered. And mm-hmm. now it's being included in this collection so readers can, and fans of the Escapists can see it for the first time.
And it was done by, sorry to interrupt. It was done by Matt Kindt's Senior, which is a cartoonist we've never heard about.
That's right.
So I enjoy that, and the fact that the story itself has annotations from the editor saying this is not good, or you constantly make comments about the female character not having enough chest.
Yeah.
So the editor is like, larger. And I like this idea of showing the page, and so it's almost like an artifact of the time, which is what Sonny Liu did. And I'm thinking more recently, Ed Pisker's X-Men. Have you read this? The Grand Design, X-Men Grand Design?
It is on my reading list. But it also has that look of Hip Hop Family Tree, though.
Correct. Yeah, but it kind of reproduced the comic book of that period, like the paper, the texture.
Right.
And I don't know, I've read those on PDFs. So, and I know it's different. The colors glow, like I've read them on my iPad. So I don't know if there's a lot of differences between stories in terms of the treatment of the colors, or in the EC one that we just mentioned, the colors are very flat, like an EC comic. Mm-hmm. So I enjoyed when they did that. There are stories where the artists just used their own style and didn't really change anything. Why not?
Right. Well, you mentioned the Matt Kindt story. That was one of my favorites, especially in the second collection. But I think even one of my favorites between these two Omnibi volumes. And one of the reasons is not only did Kindt give it an older look, and even this is on glossy paper. It does look like if you touch it, it would feel like old paper from a really old comic book.
Yeah, it has marks like it's been water damaged, or it's musty, or it's little dots on
exactly.
On the page.
But another reason I like this is it's Matt Kindt being Matt Kindt.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So you have not only the text, but you have the paratext that becomes a part of the text. Mm-hmm. Ironically enough, and I really do love that aspect of Matt Kindt. No, one example of a story that, getting back to my earlier question to you, if maybe you thought that some of these stories in trying to emulate a particular style or historical period kind of went overboard. I don't know if this is one of those that went overboard, but it did kind of strike me as maybe a potential example. This is in the first collection, and it is the Escapist's girlfriend, Miss Plum Blossom. And so this is one of those stories that is supposed to, I guess, be a romance comic, but also one that is empowering for women. And basically what you have, I guess the gist of this story is that Plum Blossom is heartbroken because there is this, what is her name? She's a villain. Deadly Nightshade. That's right. that the escapist ends up falling for. But we learn that Deadly Nightshade actually has some kind of spell that she's trying under which she's trying to control the escapist. And so that's why the escapist seems to be all agog over her at the expense of Miss Plumblossom. But the thing about this story is at the very end of this story, Plumblossom kind of asserts herself in a way that, I don't know, within 1 or 1.5 pages seems rather abrupt, given everything we've seen before. And so, again, that's just one of those examples, possibly, where you have the creators taking a particular style or historical period and really ramping it up quite a bit.
Is it because of the short format? Maybe they don't have the space, so it feels too abrupt?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there are other examples that I recall throughout these two collections where they're trying to be maybe a little too cute at times or trying to be a little too ironic or funny. And I saw what they were doing, and I appreciated the attempt. But I think it's those more subdued stories that I seem to appreciate more. For instance, in the second volume, and I can't remember the title of this. Oh, this is the Howard Chaykin story, the Escapist Liberators.
Yes.
Yes, and this is the one that takes place during the Second World War.
In France.
In France, yes, and there's your French connection, the French connection. But, you know, Chaykin also has a story, you know, Are You Now or Have You Ever, that's in the first collection.
Yes.
And I think that's another example of an escapist story that takes part in a particular historical period and doesn't overdo it. I think they're really well executed. I mean, it's Howard Chaykin after all.
Yeah, I think he does a good job of placing the escapist in that particular time period. It's 1944 in Paris, and he connects it with the Nazis confiscating all the artwork that they deemed unworthy and that could not be shown because it was contrary to their view of degenerate, and all the Picassos and other masters of the early 20th century. And it reads like he does a good job of showing the tension in France between the collaborators and the resistance, and so it has that feel. Plus, the bad guy's name is Pascal, so it's even better for that.
Yeah.
I have one nitpick though about this story, and I was surprised because
what, the Chabon Liberators?
Mm-hmm. Is that he mentions Edith Piaf and Maurice Chevalier, and to kind of illustrate the like what Edith Piaf was doing during that time, and she was singing in Paris during the occupation. That's correct. However, in the comic book, she's singing La Vie en Rose. That's the song La Vie en Rose, right? I guess because it's the most popular one, so you had to put something people could recognize. But actually, it was not written until the end of World War II. So in 1944, it couldn't have been played. So that's just a nitpick. But
that's a pretty good nitpick, though.
Yeah, we could bring it up next time we see him at the con. I won't do that because that's too...
Well, I don't know if we have any Edith Piaf fans who listen to the podcast, so I'm glad that you caught that.
Yeah, I had to look it up, but I thought, this is strange. It seems too early, but it's very close. It was like 46. I think they wrote it in 46, and it became big in 46, 47. But 3 years. Oh, well, maybe he thought, what else can I write? You know, if you put it on another song that's less popular, people might not get the connection. I don't know. But other than that, it is a successful, very successful story and enjoyable. And it doesn't, I mean, he manages to, you know, put the escapist in shackles so he can do his thing, but it's not it works in the story, and it's meaningful with the historical context. I think it works well, and he doesn't change his style to make it look like a comic from the 40s, but I think it works anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But to go back to the one that is right before, which is the Eisner one, I was curious to what was your take on that one?
Yeah, okay. I was hoping you wouldn't ask me. I'm an absolute gigantic fan of Eisner, of course, and you're right. This is an important story because, from all appearances, it's the last thing he did before he died. And we get. Pardon?
Reluctantly, that's what.
Yeah. In fact, we have a short essay, a one-page essay by Diana Schultz, the editor, who actually was the one. She was working with Eisner and his Dark Horse stuff. She was also working with the Escapist project. And so, as she says in her brief essay that comes right before the story, The Escapist and the Spirit, she kind of brokered some kind of mutually beneficial crossover between the two, where Will Eisner would do a story about the Escapist using the Spirit. And Eisner, as she says, was a little reluctant to do this, but he did it nonetheless, because once he agreed to something, he committed to it. And she had to kind of drag it out of him, or at least she had to wait for it to come out of him, because, as she mentioned, it took a little longer than she anticipated. And he wasn't necessarily interested in revisiting the Spirit. And as she put it at the end of that essay, it's rather bittersweet in many ways. On the one hand, this is the last thing that Eisner turned in before he died, and he didn't necessarily want to do a Spirit story, but that's what he did, his last piece. On the other hand, as she said, it's rather appropriate that he ended his career. The last thing he turned in to be published was a Spirit story, because it was the Spirit that really did put him on the map in terms of a creator. I mean, he had the Eisner and Iger house, of course, before that. Before the Spirit, but he's primarily known to many for his work on the Spirit, and so that's what he went out on, so to speak. Now, I like this story well enough. How do I put this? It seems a little lightweight. There's not much to it, and maybe that's part of its grace.
Yeah, and that's what I felt when I read it the first time, and I get the Schultz's point that it's it's kind of a perfect circle that he's finishing on the Spirit, but this story is actually about making comics, and it's about publishing books, and I find even that point more important, because basically the setup is you have Cavalier and Clay, those two fictional comic book writer and artist, who are waiting for the first print of the book, right, that they put out. They're waiting for it to be delivered. So I was thinking, what is this? This has to be a graphic novel, right? It has to, which to me is, it's Eisner doing this, so it's even more meaningful. But and then the story is fairly simple. They're waiting, and the person the courier, right, who's supposed to deliver the book, gets mugged, and then the Spirit comes along and intercedes, but he loses he gets knocked out, and it's actually we discovered that it's Pigel that was actually behind the attack, and he's bound and locked up in some jail, and his cellmate, the guy next to him in the jail next door, is the Escapist, and the spirit is bound with ropes, and the escapist is bound with this crazy, metal contraption, right? Like something that runs on electricity, and the spirit gets out of the ropes. That's no big deal for him, and then the escapist. That's kind of a stupid gag, right? Mm-hmm. The escapist cannot get out of those shackles. He says, "I can't. It's electronic. I can't get out of them." And the spirit notices that it's plugged to an outlet in the wall and just unplugs it, and it comes off. And on first read, I thought this is kind of a stupid, right? And then they run off together, the escapist and the spirit, and they talk about. It's very meta. They talk about their own. Talk about the authors, basically.
Yeah. Well, in fact, after the spirit unplugs, literally, the escapist and frees him, the escapist says, "Thanks, spirit, but don't tell anyone about this. Escaping is my specialty, you see." And then I love what the spirit says after that. You can count on it. And I was saved by a superhero. Wow. Eisner will have an ulcer if he ever hears about it. And then we get the very last page of the story, which is, I guess, what you were referring to, where the spirit says, "Tell me, escapist, have you ever wondered what heroes do for society?" And the escapist responds, "Don't have much time to dwell on why, but I guess what we give are instant solutions and happy endings. Mm-hmm. Society just wants to watch us do it again and again. Eh, spirit?" And then the spirit says, "Oh, wait." And then he gives him the book that he had rescued from the villains. Here, give this to Cavalier and Clay. And then the escapist says, "Whew, the first edition of their book. Now that is a happy ending." So yeah, you're right. To some degree, it gets a little reflective in a meta way. But again, it seems rather light. It's like they don't, Eisner doesn't explore it very much. Not that I necessarily expected him to. I think that the story that we have here is good in and of itself. It just strikes me as, and again, I come back to the word kind of light or lightweight. But this makes sense given Diana Schultz's essay that comes right before that, when we learned that Eisner really didn't want to do this, but he agreed to it. And so he stuck with it. I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but it's almost as if his heart wasn't entirely in this story. Well, but what I also find fascinating is that at this point, he's in his 90s, right? Yeah, this is right before he died. And you can see that the lettering is a little shaky, but the artwork is perfect. There's, it's not super polished because it's sketched, but it is so good, and his storytelling is perfect. There is like no. That's just fascinating just to see, to somebody at that age, being still completely in control of what he's doing. I don't know. That just I find it quite touching and awesome. Yeah. not in the original meaning, and and the opening page. I think it's a typical Eisner splash. Yeah, and it has this. He uses a facade as a comic book page, basically, because the characters we are reading each panel is a window on the facade, right? You're reading the facade, and this building. So there's the escapist facade, and then the other facade is a spirit facade. But these two actually are not in the same space, but they are on the comic book page. So it's kind of interesting how he's building this structure. It's like two comic book pages connected together. Right. I don't know. And you also have what Joel Seifert called the Eisner spritz, right? The way that Eisner draws rain. Yeah, of course. Although this time the rain doesn't seem like it's blanketing down as much as it does, let's say, in A Contract with God. Yeah, it's still a lot of rain. Yeah. But yeah, so I think it's great that
they were able to include this, and that he finished it on time for the. It's quite the cherry on the cake.
Right. Now, it's interesting. Now that I think of it, most of the stories that we've been discussing, at least in some bit of detail, have been in, for the most part, the second volume. Mm-hmm. What from the first volume, Amazing Adventures, really stands out to you?
Well, I have to say I really enjoyed the Brian K. Vaughan story, To Reign in Hell.
Mm-hmm.
With art by Roger Peterson. And I'm not very familiar with Peterson, but I really like his artwork. I feel sometimes that in some of those stories, there is a little bit too much text. It's very text heavy, maybe because they want to put a lot of information, and it doesn't breathe very well. Like some of those stories feel very dense when you look at the page. You're like, oh my God, what is this? It seems, and this one flows very well. And the premise is basically an agent of I forgot their name now. The chain, was it the missing link? His name is Link.
Yeah, the Iron Chain.
The Iron Chain, the evil force. Mm-hmm. His name is Link. He's trying to convince Big Al, who is a sidekick of the Escapist, to join their cause. And he's kind of trying to manipulate him. And throughout the story, it seems that it's working. And there is a twist at the end. And it's, but I think what made the story more successful is that there's a twist, and we realize he was just playing them. Big Al was playing the bad guys to actually find where they are, and then the Escapist comes in, and happy ending, which is exactly the point of Eisner in his story, right? It's neatly wrapped up, except there is this final page,
full page panel,
where you see Big Al in his he's in his small room, and his guy is like 8 feet tall, right? And so every place for him feels like a prison because he's so tall, which is, I think, another theme in there that's kind of interesting, because they're supposed to, be part of the escape. They allow people to escape, but although he's in the team, he feels, I think, constrained by his size, and he's alone in his room, and he pulls out the card, which is really tiny, that Mr. Link gave him, mm-hmm. and he's contemplating. So there's this ambiguity at the end that maybe what he saw on the other side was not that bad, and maybe that his loyalty may be in question. And I just it's a simple idea, but Brian K. Vaughan is so good at taking a simple concept and making it interesting, and his writing is so fluid, and I just I really like that one.
Yeah, I enjoyed that one as well, especially that last full page panel that you had mentioned. Mm-hmm. There are a couple others that really stand out to me in the first omnibus volume, and for, I guess, more experimental purposes than anything. And the first, in fact, they come one right after the other. The first one is Union City Blues. And this is supposed to be one of the Escapist stories that appeared in Sunshine Comics, or at least comics published by Danny Sunshine, which is part of this faux history, right?
The Weird Years, right? That's what they call them?
Yeah, the Weird Years. Now, this story is actually written by Stuart Moore with art by Phil Winslade. And the thing about it that I like so much, it starts off as a story with some kind of social awareness, right? That the escape, it takes place during the Nixon administration. And of course, there are references to the Watergate break-ins, when Nixon's on the phone when the escapist first comes to his office. But basically, the escapist is ordered by Nixon to go break up this union that is going to cause problems with munitions manufacturing that's going to really screw up his, the war that he has going on in Laos, right? That he's not supposed to be, having going on. And so when the escapist gets to this protest, he begins to sympathize with the picketers, the protesters. And then you turn the page and you have 3 pages in a row where the art is strikingly different and the tone takes a 180-degree turn, right? Which is anti-union, whereas the earlier story seemed to be pro-union. And then you're wondering, what the hell's going on? And then there's the page that follows, where we get a piece from, this faux historical figure, Danny Sunshine. And I guess it's his column called Danny's Dialogue. And basically what he does is he kind of explains between the lines what happened in that comic. He saw that this was a story about the unionization of writers and artists, not just, necessarily a munitions manufacturers. And so, he put the kibosh on it, and he had someone step in to finish the story at the last minute, and that's why it ends in such a poor and clunky manner. And so I thought that was somewhat clever. I appreciated that. And then the story that follows that is called, Thrilling Torture? It's part of Thrilling Torture Comics. And I guess the title of this is Letter Perfect. Yeah, Letter Perfect, because the story and art is by Michael T. Gilbert. And basically what you have is kind of a story that is tangentially about the escapist, but basically it's about creators who really aren't getting a fair shake from their publisher. And the hero at the end becomes the letterer.
Of course. And you see the hand, the actual picture of the hand lettering.
And then throughout the story, both the escapist and also the publisher, who, of course, is this kind of slimy guy, is bombarded with letters and sign. Anything that deals with lettering, the letterer has control over, and the letterer is using it to bludgeon these figures. First the escapist for potentially helping the publisher, and then definitely the publisher himself.
Yeah, there's a play on the form that's really, really fun.
Yeah, so I thought that was clever. And, there are certain stories like that, and this is not one of those that I was suggesting earlier that kind of takes it a little too far. I mean, I don't want to suggest that some of these stories take the concept and go a little too far, but maybe they push the boundaries at times. What did you think of the Harvey Pekar piece that Dean Haspiel illustrated? This is also in that first volume, Escape from the Hospital.
Let me see.
Because that's basically a story about Harvey Pekar, not so much about the escapist.
Yeah, it reads like a Pekar story, and then he's just...
Yeah. I mean, I thought that was okay. I appreciated that. In fact, it was written by Harvey Pekar. So... and then the story that follows that, we have actually a series of Luna Moth stories, but I think that Old Flame, the one by Kevin McCarthy, who does most of the writing of these stories, these original stories, and art by Dan Brereton, is pretty good, especially the art. Brereton's art is phenomenal in Old Flame.
Yeah, it's a fully painted work. Yeah, he doesn't... Yeah. He's not very... comes up with stories once in a while, but it's always interesting to see his work. Yeah. Definitely.
Are there any other stories between these two volumes that kind of stand out to you that you want to discuss?
Let's see, there's something else. There's so many.
Yeah, that's one of the problems with anthologies. You mentioned that at times they can be uneven, but there's just so much here. Like I said, there are 26 stories in the first volume and 22 in the second. So basically, we're looking at not quite 50 pieces Because I think we've covered a good bit of ground in both of these volumes.
I hope we've given enough information so people will check them out. I think it's a worthy collections, and the fact that they put all this together as big volumes is very handy, and you don't have to hunt for back issues. And I'm guessing they're pretty nice. I haven't seen them, but you have one of them, right?
Yes, I have the first volume, and I hope to get the second volume at some point in the very near future.
Are they soft cover?
Soft cover, yes. So we looked at the 2 Omnibi volumes from Dark Horse of Michael Chabon's The Escapist. That includes Michael Chabon's The Escapist Amazing Adventures, which came out in February. And then the second volume, which comes out this week, wide release, Michael Chabon's The Escapist Pulse-Pounding Thrills. Good stuff.
That's right. Yes.
Yes. And if you want to find great books like this, and in fact, as Pascal pointed out at the top of the show, check out Discount Comic Book Service. There you can find both volumes that we discussed, both Amazing Adventures and Pulse Pounding Thrills, at 40% off of the cover price if you go to dcbservice.com right now. And after you do get your Escapist volumes there, get in touch with us and let us know your experiences with Michael Chabon's The Escapist. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can reach us by email at 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or if you want to reach me directly, I'm Pascal at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. We'll be back with the regular review show next week, and then later this month, Pascal and I will be back for a Eurocomics episode, so be sure to check back for that.
Yeah, we'll be there.
That's right. Until then, I'm Derek.
I'm Pascal.
Goodbye.
Au revoir.
Hey, what happened?